But nearly 500 years later, you can still find 2 Becket relics in Canterbury. They're here, in a small chapel at the Catholic Church of St. Thomas. This modern reliquary contains 2 relics of Thomas Becket, a shard of bone and a tiny piece of blood-stained vestment. Now, they survived the destruction of his shrine because in the early 1200s they were sent abroad as part of a drive to extend the scope of his spiritual influence across Christendom. And they were only returned to this country in the last century when they were donated to this church. The bone came from a religious foundation in Belgium and the vestment came from Italy. And if these really are authentic relics of Thomas Becket, then they're objects of extraordinary historical importance. But it's only when you really get up close to them, as I am now, that I think you can feel the sheer amount of faith that's been invested in these fragments. To those who really believe the spirit of Becket himself is still alive there, that is holy matter, the most precious thing of all. To see how blood and bones came to be imbued with such significance, you have to go back to the 1st century after Christ's death, when there were no churches and Christians were brutally tortured and executed for their beliefs. The only way to keep the faith alive was for Christians to mimic the Roman practice of honouring the dead by gathering at their tombs on feast days. The early Christians inherited this Roman and relatively new veneration of the dead, but they gave it their own twist. You have to remember that theirs was a proscribed religion, a persecuted religion. They had to bury their dead. They had to venerate their ancestors in secret. And in a sense, down in the catacombs, as they did so, that was all they had. They only had the bones of their forefathers, the early Christian martyrs' relics, and their faith, and that was it. And I think that combination of circumstances explains why the relic, through the centuries for Christians, has had such a deep, primal power. By the time the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in the 4th century, the idea that relics provided a direct link to the saints in heaven was a core belief. And over the next 1,000 years, the reliquary developed into a sophisticated art form, so that by medieval times, it had become a type of sculpture that very precisely reflected the nature of the relics inside. So, a few fragments of skull would be contained in a head reliquary. Or, in this case, pieces of bone from the saint's hand or arm would have been visible through these tiny windows. I've come here to meet Sister Wendy Becket, who has a deep knowledge of relics and reliquaries, and a deep emotional attachment to them. How do you think the power of the relic is expressed by the splendour of the reliquary?
The glory of the container is meant to show the glory of the saint. So that was the first desire, something beautiful, to show what it means to love God, and if possible, to get in something about the life of the saint.
So here, for example, we seem to have a Catherine relic, because there's Catherine with her Catherine wheel. It's almost like a storybook.
It is a story. There's St. Catherine, whose relics are said to be in here at the top. holding her wheel so insouciantly, spinning it round almost. And then round are the stories of her life. Here you have the famous story of how, as a young girl, Our Lady appeared with the child Jesus, who put a ring on her finger. And from then on, she wanted to be a virgin dedicated to him. So when the emperor fell in love with her, Catherine said no. So he brings 50 pagan philosophers to talk her down. And she talks them down, converts the whole 50, who were then promptly beheaded. And then they show St. Catherine being beheaded herself. She was originally going to be ripped apart by a wheel.
God struck it with a
Yes.
thunderbolt, didn't he?
Yes.
But inside this, presumably there would have been, or perhaps there still is, one of her bones.
What they would have thought was one of her bones.
What they would have thought. Take communion,
Absolutely.
and he will be filled with the power of God.
Yeah. It's so that's really why it's such a densely powerful object.
But what's beneath the stone?
Beneath the stone, there are relics of some 40 saints.
40 saints?
40 saints, yeah. So it's an incredibly powerful object for that reason.
So how long has the museum owned this extraordinary thing?
It was acquired in 1902.
And did you know from the beginning, did the museum know that it contained all these relics?
I think we probably suspected that it did, but we didn't open it until the late 70s, early 80s.
Have you seen the contents taken out?
I haven't seen the contents taken out. This will be the first time that I see them taken out.
So are you looking forward to it?
I'm looking forward to it very much, yeah.
I can't wait. That's amazing. I hadn't imagined that they'd all be sort of scrunched up together in that way. I thought it was going to be sort of more...
It's a very compact arrangement, yeah.
It's like you couldn't get another one in there. You're starting with the relics of Saint Gotthard. I have to say, he's not one of my saints that I know about.
He's connected very closely to the history of Hildesheim, which is where this portable altar was made.
When was he canonised?
He's active in the late 10th and perhaps the first quarter of the 11th century, and is canonised shortly after his death within the 11th century. So it's a recent history in terms of the manufacture of this altarpiece.
So that all suggests to me that it's probably very likely that those really are the remains of the real Gotthard in that bundle. He's a local saint,
Absolutely.
relatively recent.
Yeah.
This particular relic is supposed to be a tiny fragment of bone.
Gosh, there it is.
It looks like what it purports to be, doesn't it?
Conservator Nicole Rode, whose job it is to check the condition of each of these fragile bundles, turns next to the relic of a rather more famous saint, St. John the Evangelist.
What do you think you're going to find inside?
I believe there's a number of strands of hair inside this bundle. There we go. And the hair is surprisingly quite bright. It's quite yellow.
But it's the same colour as the hair of St. John the Evangelist in Leonardo's Last Supper. He's the most angelic, yeah.
Absolutely.
And the favourite. He's Christ's favourite. In all those depictions of the Last Supper, John has got his head on the shoulder of Christ. So that hair would have actually touched Christ. So it would be almost yet more imbued.
Absolutely.
with
What a
sacred...
wonderful thought.
I suppose the first question a sceptical modern viewer will have is, is this really the hair of John the Evangelist? But I rather like the idea that John the Evangelist is said to have had blonde hair. And, hey presto, you open the bundle after how many hundreds of years and the hair is blonde. So, but what if you could venerate, perhaps even touch, a relic of Jesus Christ himself? According to the Bible, Christ's body ascended directly, miraculously to heaven, but there are nonetheless relics associated with him, and that's why I'm here in Paris, because here they hold the holiest of all those remains.
At Notre Dame Cathedral on the first Friday of every month, a remarkable service takes place. The veneration of the crown of thorns relic has been in Paris for nearly 800 years, but not always in Notre Dame. It was originally housed here, at the Sainte-Chapelle, the private church of the wealthiest and most pious king in all of Christendom, Louis IX of France.
Now, I've been told if you want to experience the full impact of the Sainte-Chapelle, you've got to come here horribly early in the morning, just as the sun is beginning to rise, on your own. And that, amazingly enough, is what I've been allowed to do. Wow, I mean, it is completely stunning. And the Sainte-Chapelle has often been described as the single most beautiful medieval building in the world. But it's only if you come now, I think, that you really do appreciate quite how this building works. It's a space that is meant to be just light and colour, almost no sense of structure at all, a building that has dissolved into light and colour. These great walls of stained glass windows which tell the whole story of the Bible. And if you look at those windows through half-closed eyes, and you look at them almost in an abstract sense, you get this intense blue and these vivid drops of red. It's almost like looking into a sky flecked with blood. And I think that symbolism is actually very important. I think it takes you to the heart of what this building was for. Many people who visit this place don't actually know that it's not a cathedral, it's not really a chapel in the conventional sense. It's a gigantic reliquary box.
King Louis had this entire building constructed as a setting for the crown of thorns. It's an astonishing statement of earthly and divine power. Emily Guerry has made a study of the art of the Sainte-Chapelle.
Hi, Emily.
Hi, nice to see you.
What a fantastic space, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's a
I feel like we're eating colour when we're in here. So, Emily, how did Louis actually acquire this famous relic, the crown of thorns?
Well, his cousin, who is the Latin emperor of Byzantium, his name Baldwin, he wrote Louis in 1238 saying, I'm in big trouble, our empire is being invaded, we're in need of money, we're in need of an army, can you help us? And by the way, the relics in my imperial collection need someone to take care of them. So Louis immediately dispatched somewhere in the realm of 140,000 livres. That's equivalent to half of his annual income as one of the wealthiest rulers in Christendom.
So that's half of the entire annual national budget of France.
Of France, yes. So the crown of thorns relic was then given by Baldwin to Louis as an offering of thanksgiving for his assistance.
Wow.
So it's a gift because the sale of relics is technically illegal. Louis did not purchase the crown of thorns, he acquired it. And here we have the story in glass. This is window A. It's the history of the Passion relics. You can see in the second lancet over, that's Louis reacting to seeing the crown for the first time. And when Louis first saw the relic, he was overcome with tears. And here in the stained glass windows, the crown of thorns is actually painted green. It's a living crown. It would have it's still growing in a way.
So when the relic arrives in France from Constantinople, what kind of ceremony does Louis devise to mark its arrival into the city?
If you just crane your neck a bit, At the very top, it shows the ceremony of Louis carrying the crown of thorns in its reliquary with his brother, Robert of Artois. And they march through the streets in August of 1239. And the adoring public come to welcome the king and his crown. And not only the people are there, but also clerics are invited to bring out the relics of Parisian saints to bow to Christ's relic, in effect welcoming Christ to Paris.
And he's barefoot,
He's barefoot here.
which is a great statement for a king to be barefoot. It's humility.
Yes, and because you're in the presence of God himself.
Yeah. And what does he actually do with it? I mean, other than house it, venerate it.
What he did was he gave bits that were thorns of the crown to missionaries, to other rulers, to diplomats.
So he would actually break thorns off the crown.
Yes,
That's an amazing thing, because you'd think that this is such a precious object, he'd want to keep it intact, but he's actually...
It's the best way he could express his thanks as a king to those who helped him, was to give him a bit of the thing that mattered most to him, that is the crown of thorns.
One of the few surviving thorns given away by Louis IX is now in the British Museum, concealed within a beautiful and intricate locket.
So James, how is this intriguing little object catalogued in the collections of the British Museum?
It's catalogued as a pendant reliquary of the Holy Thorn. So it's actually one of the most precious jewels we have, not so much because of the external surface of it, which is amethyst and gold, but because of what it contains inside. It's secured in place by these two small pins, and I'm going to take them out now so you can get some sense of just how beautiful it is inside. Then it opens rather like a miniature altarpiece.
Oh, good Lord.
And that's the first face of it.
That's
And you
extraordinary.
see it's decorated with translucent enamel laid in shallow fields. It's known as basse-taille.
What's the decoration?
At the top you can see there's a Virgin and Child with two angels. And at the bottom there's an image of a king and queen. Now, based on the date of the enamels, which we date to about 1340, we can deduce that this is probably Philippe VI and his wife Jeanne de Bourgogne. And the king barefoot in imitation of St. Louis.
So it's almost like a mini Sainte-Chapelle.
It's like a mini Sainte-Chapelle.
How amazing.
Of course, this translucent enamel looks rather like stained glass.
That's just fantastic.
But the real secret, in fact, the real mystery of the object is contained beneath this panel that shows the Nativity.
Beneath the vellum?
Absolutely.
So,
And with
so as it were, it's in the middle?
Yes. If I do this,
Oh, goodness me.
and there you have the relic. So in the centre, you see a thorn from the Holy Crown of Thorns.
What an amazing object. The design of the jewellery suggests that this was a very, very intimate feeling object.
Yes. Yeah,
And this is
yeah.
something that somebody perhaps carried on their person.
Well, when it's closed, you see it's not something that would be easily worn. Now, the
Physical value.
How do you think it was actually used?
I think you'd probably use it for private prayer. One person just alone with the object, in dialogue with the divine.
And if you were Jean-Duc de Berry and you were in your last days dying,
I think if he knew he was dying, this is what he would want to look at. But it's pretty certain that Jean de Berry himself didn't, because this is made in the 1390s. When he does die in 1416, he's in Paris. The English have invaded and occupied Paris after Agincourt, and almost all his goldsmith's work is melted down by the English. So we have to assume that he gave it away as a very grand present.
so with this object we're at the end of the 14th century, but even then, am I not right in thinking that there was a kind of gathering discontent with the very idea of relics and with these splendid objects? Not everybody thinks this is a good idea.
Now, there's obviously always a concern about the connection between wealth and access to God, and the kind of world where the possession of a relic might give you privileged access is the kind of word in which people question that privilege. And as the Reformation nears, it becomes a stronger and stronger issue.
So the storm clouds are gathering over things like this.
They are. And when the lightning strikes, particularly in England, it strikes savagely.
The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century changed the landscape of faith in this country forever.
The Reformation ushered in a bleak and bitter period for those adhering to the old Catholic traditions of worship. Churches were pillaged, stained glass windows were smashed, statues and paintings ripped down, shrines were desecrated, and relics in their thousands were destroyed. But the old impulse to venerate and to cherish the remains of the saints could not be so easily rooted out, and it continued in secret and undercover. And if you want to understand that history, largely a concealed history, there's no better place to come than this.
At this Jesuit school, they have a remarkable museum. It's a repository of objects from a faith that was suddenly driven underground. Jan Graffius is the curator.
Wow.
It's a nice space.
It really is.
Of all the objects here, the most revealing is also the most unassuming. Found in the 19th century, behind a wall in a nearby Catholic home, it had lain undiscovered for more than 200 years, and it's the only one of its kind in the world.
So, Jan, tell me, why have you led me to this distinctly enigmatic object, and what is this?
This is, the simple answer is that this is a travelling chest used by salesmen of threads and peddlers and so on.
What does it contain?
It contains everything a Jesuit priest would need to say Mass.
Can we open it up?
Yes, by all means, yes. I shall just put my gloves on. So the outside is pony skin and wood with these rather lovely handmade nails.
Well, at first sight, I can't see anything that suggests that this is a priest's box.
Which is quite right, because if you're wandering around and you're...
This is the chapel of St Edmund's College near Ware, and the architect of all this flamboyance was a Catholic convert named A.W.N. Pugin. The Catholic revival caught the wave of the Gothic revival, an architectural movement inspired by the medieval world. It brought rich decoration, bright colour and images of Christ and the saints back into British churches.
Rosemary Hill is Pugin's most recent biographer.
Rosemary, thank you for coming. What
Hi.
a fantastic space.
It's a wonderful space. I think it's one of Pugin's best buildings, actually, marked by this huge and beautiful stone rood screen. And the rood screen was one of the things that Pugin was most enthusiastic to revive.
R-O-O-D, meaning cross. Rood.
Meaning cross, yes,
Yeah.
with the crucified Christ above it. Rood screens existed in medieval churches. They divide the part of the church where the congregation sits from the sanctuary. One of the many ironies of Pugin's career, of course, was that he used all the steam power and technology of the Victorian age to push art and architecture back 300 years. And what he was trying to do here is to recreate the essence of medieval Gothic art.
So it's sort of Stevenson's rocket in reverse. Pugin's backward rocket.
Absolutely. And one of the things that Pugin wanted to do was to remake, if you like, that kind of breach in history that the Reformation had caused.
So I was very struck looking at this drawing of, the design for the chapel here. I mean, okay, yes, it's in monochrome, but having just visited the chapel, I can see all those colours. I can feel that coming through. Do you think that was part of Pugin's ambition, so to speak, to re-enchant
sacred space.
Certainly, I think there were a lot of people who, by then, were feeling pretty starved by what the English church was offering, which was very square Georgian preaching boxes. It was all about sermons. There was very little colour. There was very little emotional warmth.
And what was his attitude to relics?
Well, he believed in them, I think both in a sacred sense and also as romantic objects.
So, I mean, I noticed this beautiful reliquary, which is a Pugin design as well, isn't it?
Yes, it's a very architectural form, as medieval reliquaries often were, but it is like one of Pugin's buildings in miniature.
In the Middle Ages, they were using gold and precious stones to symbolise heaven and eternity. Here, he's using very polished brass and semi-precious stones, crystal.
Yes, well, this was the problem for Pugin, and indeed for the whole English Catholic community, was that after emancipation, they were like, as one of the bishops said, we're like the first family after the flood. I mean, they hadn't got anything because they hadn't been allowed to build anything. So everything was needed, and there was very little money. And poor Pugin always had to battle against accusations of Brummagem ware, the very shoddy metalwork that the Victorians churned out of Birmingham.
But to be fair to this particular made in Birmingham object, it's actually not half bad, is it?
It's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. And the detailing, the finishing is very fine. And the stones are only semi-precious stones, but they're very beautiful colours and very carefully chosen.
And whose are the bones?
The bones are of Thomas à Becket. Pugin was a great enthusiast for the English Catholic Church. So in the context of the 1840s, it is a statement of English Catholicism.
Pugin was a man of the modern industrial age who deliberately harked back to the medieval past. But the relic and the reliquary can still speak very directly to the present, the traumas of recent history, and the desire to heal their wounds. During the 1970s and 80s, a brutal campaign of repression by the military government in El Salvador claimed thousands of lives. The leader of the church, Archbishop Oscar Romero, began to speak out on behalf of the victims and their families. Finally, on the 23rd of March 1980, he made a direct appeal to the Salvadoran army.
Debe de prevalecer la ley de Dios que dice no matar. Ningún soldado está obligado a obedecer una orden contra la ley de Dios.
The following day, Oscar Romero was shot dead in church while celebrating Mass. In the eyes of most Salvadorans, Romero had been martyred, and today he is revered there as a saint, although he's not yet been declared to be one by the Vatican. Romero's body was buried, but his possessions, including the vestments he was wearing when he died, have become modern relics. Jan Graffius, curator at Stonyhurst College, was closely involved in helping to preserve them.
So what are the relics and what's happened to them?
The main relics are the contents of his tiny little 3-room house in the grounds of the hospice where he lived. And in the little back room are the clothes he was wearing when he was shot.
What do they look like?
Well, he was a very simple man, so they're very simple clothes. A simple purple chasuble, the semicircular garment that a priest wears when he's saying Mass, very thin cotton. Underneath that, a white alb, which is a floor-length white garment.
Are they very bloodstained?
They're very bloodstained. On the chasuble, there is a tiny, tiny little hole directly over the heart, and no sign of anything else. But when you look at the white alb underneath, it gives you some idea of the violence of his death. It's completely coated in blood.
Are they just leaving it completely as it was without touching it?
Pretty much. It's now in a position where it should be safer from the point of view of environment. But at the end of my work, I was there over 3 years, at the end of my work, the sisters presented me with a tiny piece of the blood-soaked alb to take back to Stonyhurst. It lives in this very small jewellery box, which is how it was given to me. And inside is just...
Goodness.
We're in the process of commissioning a reliquary, and we've asked Fernando Yort, who's a very famous Salvadoran artist, to design and paint something appropriate.
So it strikes me that it's an object rather like a folding altarpiece with wings, and you've got two angels on the front?
We've got the Annunciation on the outside with Gabriel and Mary. Then when you open it up, we have this central painting, and around it I will have painted the readings from the Mass that he was saying when he was murdered, and a quotation from his last sermon, which was spoken seconds before he was shot. The gospel that he was reading was about the grain of wheat that falls to the ground, and unless it dies, it remains a grain. But if it dies, it brings back a rich harvest.
He knew he was going to die.
Oh, he did, yes, yes.
And will this all be coloured?
Brightly, brightly coloured. When I was last there, I saw in one of the markets this little Christmassy triptych, which I bought for one of my children. This is not by Yort, but it's very much in his style.
In a sense, it's El Salvadorian folk
Very,
art,
yes, yes.
with these very bright colours.
Very strong colours.
So that gives us a sense of what your reliquary will eventually look like.
Yeah.
Where are you going to keep the relic?
It's such a tiny little fragment that what I plan to do is to have a little silver and glass locket, which will be fixed permanently underneath the main painting, and above it, this central figure here, you can see this is Archbishop Romero himself, with his hand outstretched, holding his heart, and at the bottom, the rifle that killed him.
And what do you hope it will say to the world?
I want it to get some idea of the vibrancy of the culture and the people who Romero was standing up for. I want people to go away and think, who was this man? And learn more about him. And I want them to understand that working for truth and justice and peace has a terrible cost, but that the end of your life is not the end of the struggle. In Stonyhurst College, where it will be displayed, we have many young people who are beginning to learn that the world has much injustice, and I want them to go and find out more, and maybe, in their own small ways, work to promote a more just and peaceful world.
When I set off on this journey into the art of the reliquary, I had my own preconceptions. I felt this was very much going to be an exploration of death and religion. And yes, of course, those things are there. I think of that wonderful Holy Thorn reliquary in the British Museum, an object designed for the contemplation of a man in his last days, perhaps fixing his eyes on God. But there's so much else to the art of the reliquary as well. I think of that extraordinary eye of Edward Oldcorn, a thing that speaks so eloquently of a community's determination to survive persecution and oppression. I think of that wonderful silver St. Sebastian reliquary, and I think of a very different community's desire to survive the strike of an epidemic. And perhaps above all, I think of that amazing little birth amulet, once held by a woman absolutely determined to give birth to a healthy child. So yes, reliquaries at the literal level speak of death, they contain emblems of death, but I think at the deepest level of all, what they really speak about is life, the passions that move us all as human beings.